For basically our entire lives, we've been told that civilization started about 6,000 years ago. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the very first and maybe even the most advanced chapter of our human story was just erased? Well, let's dive into the evidence that's completely rewriting our past.
Seriously, think about the history you learned back in school. It always had a nice, neat starting point, right? But what if that story is totally incomplete? What if the real beginning has been buried this whole time just waiting for someone to find it?
So, the official story, the one in all the textbooks, it starts in one specific place, Mesopotamia. The idea is that around 6,000 years ago, this is where it all began. This is where civilization, as we know it, finally kicked off.
So why Mesopotamia? Well, it's because that's the first place where we find all the things we define as civilization. You've got complex social structures, some form of organized government, big impressive architecture, and the development of knowledge, like writing. That's the checklist, and Mesopotamia, dating back to about 4000 BC, was the first one to tick all the boxes.
According to that accepted timeline, before this point, humans were just simple hunter-gatherers. No big organized societies, no massive stone structures, just nomadic tribes. That's been the story for decades. But what if it's completely wrong? All right, let's start with the first piece of evidence that just doesn't quite fit the official story. It's this one artifact that basically blows a giant hole in our historical timeline. Okay, so in ancient Sumeria, which is part of Mesopotamia, archaeologists dug up something they now call the Sumerian king list. It's exactly what it sounds like, a list of rulers. But trust me, this is no ordinary list of kings. Not even close.
The list details some impossible reigns. King Alulim, for example, apparently ruled for 28,800 years. Alengar, 36,000 years. But here's the crucial part. The list divides history into two distinct eras. Before the flood, which is where you find these crazy long reigns, and after the flood, where suddenly the numbers become much more realistic.
So this forces us to ask a really important question. Is this just mythology, campfire stories? Or is it a distorted memory? A kind of fragmented record of a much, much older era of civilization that existed long before the one we all know about.
Now that Sumerian king list is a fascinating clue for sure, but it's not the only one. There's actual physical evidence buried for thousands of years that points to an even more concrete, forgotten chapter of human history.
So back in the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was looking at a site in Turkey that everyone had pretty much dismissed as just a medieval cemetery. But what he found there, it would turn history completely on its head. It wasn't a cemetery at all. It was a massive, incredibly sophisticated temple complex we now call Göbekli Tepe.
And here's the big problem for our old timeline. Carbon dating showed Göbekli Tepe is 11,000 years old. It was built around 9,000 BC. That is 5,000 years before Mesopotamia and 6,000 years before Stonehenge. And get this, it was supposedly built by those simple hunter-gatherers.
I mean, the timeline here is just staggering. Göbekli Tepe is older than the Great Pyramids by 7,000 years. So the question becomes, how could a nomadic people, who supposedly didn't even have agriculture or writing yet, build something so vast and so complex?
And here's the thing. Göbekli Tepe isn't some lonely outlier. Archaeologists have found other sites that throw a wrench in the timeline. There's Çatalhöyük in Turkey, a huge settlement from 7,500 BC. Jericho, one of the oldest cities in the world, goes back to 9,000 BC. And the Natafeunt culture was already starting agriculture as far back as 12,500 BC. The evidence for organized pre-Mesopotamian societies is just overwhelming.
So, with all of this evidence piling up, why are we still taught that Mesopotamia was the first civilization, right? Why haven't our history books been totally rewritten? Well, the answer seems to be a little complicated.
One theory points to what you might call institutional inertia. Overturning decades of established history is incredibly difficult. New discoveries that challenge the status quo, they're often met with a ton of skepticism. Funding for more research can be tough to get, and as a result, the old story can stay in place for years and years.
But there's another, way more dramatic theory. What if these early civilizations didn't just slowly fade away? What if they were literally wiped out by a global cataclysm, a catastrophic event that completely reset human progress?
Let's go back to that Sumerian king list for a second. It specifically mentions a great flood, and what's absolutely fascinating is that almost every ancient culture on Earth has a similar myth. Meanwhile, science tells us that at the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago, melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically, leading to catastrophic global flooding. So, is it possible these myths aren't myths at all, but collective memories of a real event?
And this brings us to the biggest question of all. If there was a lost era of civilization that got wiped out by a cataclysm, what did they know? What incredible knowledge was lost to time? And the mysteries, believe it or not, just keep getting deeper. Over in Indonesia, there's a site called Gunung Padang. It looks like a natural hill, but geological surveys have found man-made chambers deep inside, and the deepest layers date back over 20,000 years. That pushes the timeline even further back than Göbekli Tepe.
To build places like this would require unbelievable organization and really sophisticated knowledge of engineering, architecture, and even astronomy. These were clearly not the simple hunter-gatherers we've always pictured.
This all leads to some pretty incredible possibilities. What if we actually took these ancient sites seriously? Could we uncover lost technologies? Maybe a method for moving gigantic stones with ease? Or even an understanding of some kind of ancient energy source? I mean, the potential is just staggering.
You see, this fundamentally changes how we look at history. We tend to think of human progress as this straight upward line, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's a cycle, with these advanced civilizations rising only to be destroyed by cataclysms and then forgotten by time, forcing the survivors to basically start all over again from scratch.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it, if sites like Göbekli Tepe and Gunung Padang were just hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. What else is still out there? Buried under the desert sand or deep beneath the ocean, just waiting to completely rewrite the first chapter of our story.